Good morning. Thank you very much for attending this session. My name is Kuei Huang. We have three speakers, so they will introduce themselves. So I'm Hui Huang again, and I'm an epidemiologist, advisor based in New York. In this session, we are going to focus on vaccine safety. So in my talk, I'm going to cover two topics. First, I will briefly provide an overview on vaccine safety initiatives using electronic healthcare databases, EHD, in the US, including Vaccine Safety Data Link, VSD, and post-licensure rapid immunization safety monitoring present. And then I will provide two case studies to illustrate challenges in this area. Vaccine Safety Data Link is a pioneer for using electronic health databases to evaluate vaccine safety. It was established in 1990. It is a collaboration project among CDC and 8 integrated healthcare delivery systems. So there are two priorities for VSD. The first is to evaluate safety of newly approved vaccines or new recommendations for existing vaccines. Second is to develop and evaluate new methods for safety. Before 2004, VSD had lag time approximately 12 months, which took long time to get data. It's more like we do traditional retrospective cohort study. After 2004, the data has been updated on regular basis, which pretty much like every week. So now VSD has been conducting near real-time, evaluation. VSD has approximately 10 million population, is approximately 3% of US population. Total, they have 8 sites. 5 out of 8 from Kaiser, which is a regional health insurer in the US. The rest of 3 is from health partners and Marshfield Clinic and Harvard Pilgrim. So this slide shows VSD data sources and elements. Basically, all the VSD covers all medical encounters within healthcare plans. So you can see when a person enrolls in a healthcare plan, and then they have demographic information, enrollment information. And then, if the person goes to outpatient clinic, that will be covered, and then inpatient healthcare, like hospitalized, will be covered. And then, of course, include immunization data, as well as birth and death certificate. So I just spent a little bit of time on I think it's kind of a unique feature of VSD. It's rapid cycle analysis. This is developed to provide weekly near real-time assessment of safety of newly approved vaccines or new recommendations for existing vaccines. So for each vaccine, they select specific outcome for interest. So this outcome is based on biological plausibility. pre-licensure data or literature, and then what they do, they compare the observed number of outcome to expected number outcome. So I will point out this is hypothesis testing. It's not data mining. So because they are doing repeated testing, so they adjust for repeated testing. So one thing I want to point out is that the findings of association using this method are considered safety signal, but that doesn't mean there's true association there, but need further more studies to confirm the result. Why they move forward automatically? So for VSD has its own strengths and limitation. I think from my perspective, I think the biggest strength is it is EHR, electronic medical records. So all medical encounters are available. So compared to claims, only claimed medical events would be available. So that is, to me, this is the biggest strength of VSD. And another one is because it is EHR and it's majority of the sites from regional insurers, health insurers. So it's relatively easier to conduct medical chart review. So why we do medical chart review? Because sometimes if we want to validate the outcome of interest that identified by ICD code, so we go back to medical chart to see whether that specific outcome that are truly captured in the medical chart. So that will help us to evaluate positive predictive value of the ICD code. So in terms of limitations, I think it's the size would be a key limitation, because for 10 million, if there's a rare event, then you would be lack of sample size. So next one, I'm going to talk about present. Why this ad would advance automatically without me to push it? 它这个自己移走，我不那个按的话，它就走。哦，不，我没有动。OK， 那我自己来。哦 ，OK， be careful, the mouse moves by itself. OK, thank you， 谢谢。OK, PRESENT stands for Post-Licensure Rapid Immunization Safety Monitoring. So before I talk about PRESENT, I have to talk about Sentinel, because PRESENT is a vaccine component of Sentinel. Sentinel was established because of FADA 2007, Section 905. Based on the FADA, the FDA was going to establish an active post-marketing risk identification and analysis system to link and analyze the safety data from multiple data sources. And to do that, to access a variety of sources, including federal and private sector health-related electronic data. So this is why Sentinel was established. That was 2000. That was mini Sentinel before. And now it's called Sentinel. So FDA's vision for Sentinel is to establish a national data infrastructure to evaluate. It's moving again. Sorry. To evaluate medical product safety available to FDA as well as other stakeholders. So Sentinel's objectives primarily is to enhance Sentinel's ability to identify and investigate safety issues. Before Sentinel, FDA heavily relied on spontaneous report system to evaluate safety issues. After Sentinel, they use Sentinel to evaluate or investigate safety issues in real time. And the Sentinel also allows them to have subgroup analysis with longer term data. So this is how Sentinel works. I quickly run through. The Data Coordinating Center is, Okay, the Data Coordinating Center is a Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. Then, when FDA sent the data request, and each partner, they will go through the Sentinel Security Network portal. Then each partner receives the data request, and then they retrieve the data and run the query against their local data beyond the firewall. And the data partners reviews the results for accuracy and privacy. After that, they will send the de-identified data through the secure send portal to the Harvard Pilgrim Coordinating Center. And then Harvard will do the analysis, meta-analysis, and send the results to Sentinel, or to FDA. So originally, the presence was created by the Department of Health and Health Service in the US. It's called HHS. And the purpose was to establish a new national system for H1N1 pandemic influenza vaccine monitoring. That was in 2009. The objective, of course, is focused on, at that time, was focused on the H1N1 vaccine. But they wanted to capture rare events. This thing. I'm sorry, please bear with me. This is somehow didn't touch anything. They just goes forward without. But anyhow, probably just ask me to talk too fast. Anyhow, the data is from a National Health Insurance Plan, and this project still led by HHS, FDA, and CDC. However, in 2010, President 对不起，又开始，他自己往上跳。I'm sorry because of the technical issue that somehow the slides move forward. It's okay. 我没动，我一直 so now I mixed up. I have to. But anyhow, in 2010, Sentinel, the presence became part of Sentinel, which is vaccine component of Sentinel. So just to kind of summarize the first topic I was talking about, compared to PRISM and Sentinel, PRISM and VSD, PRISM was built on the VSD experience because VSD has been very successful. And the differences I mentioned before, I think that the key difference is that VSD uses electronic health records, but PRISM at this time primarily utilized claims administrative data. But the FDA is working on, or Sentinel is working on, to change Sentinel, the database, and change it from claims to EHR. So the agreement between is that prison utilizes data from national health plans and not a VSD site. So compared to prison versus VA ESR, so prison is an active surveillance program, but spontaneous report is a passive safety surveillance program. However, both complement each other, so they can't complement each other without each other. So the priority for prison include signal detection, signal refinement, signal evaluation, and pandemic response and vaccine safety in pregnancy. To summarize, the PRESENT is an active surveillance program, provides a new capability for FDA. Still, but that's fine. So next two speakers, just make sure I don't touch anything, but somehow it's moving forward. See, yeah. Okay, I don't know how can. Okay, try to control it. That's kind of a distracting. Okay, so the first case study is called Pregnancy Birth Outcome Assessment in Population-Based Cohort after exposure to Trememba. So Trememba was approved for prevention again. That's frustrating. Trememba was approved for prevention of invasive meningococcal disease caused by Neisseria and meningitis group B in 2014. And the indicated age is 10 to 25. And that's by CDC recommendation was 16 to 23. At the time, Pfizer submitted biological licensure application. We have we have data from 2 animal studies. The results of those 2 studies show no effect on fertility, as well as embryonic development. And for clinical studies, we excluded pregnant women. So basically, we have no data in human in terms of the outcome or effect on pregnant women. So FDA asked us to conduct a pregnancy registry. So before I talk about the pregnancy registry challenges, I just want to talk about the traditional pregnancy registry, how typically we do. So traditional pregnancy registry usually is exposure registry. So the women exposed to the products would be asked to come to the study. So what do we do? The sponsor typically put a toll-free number on the label, and then pregnant women would call the toll-free number if they think they are concerned, or for various reasons they call that number, and then the sponsor would follow up, call back the pregnant women to find out the outcome of the pregnancy. So this graph. I'm afraid of touching anything. So the first graph shows the traditional pregnancy registry. So basically, all whoever is pregnant and is exposed to the outcome of the product of interest, and then they would call the sponsor. Here is Pfizer. And there's a few limitations. The first, because the study population is poorly defined, because we don't know who would call, why do they call. So, and then because of that, we would have a hard time to find an appropriate comparison group. It can be internal or external comparison group. And then, because the exposure is based on the self-report, so sometimes it's difficult to validate that whether that's really exposed to our vaccine. On top of that, sometimes we typically encounter significant loss of follow-up. Just for example, there's a vaccine called Registry. This is a vaccine in the same class of Trememba. This vaccine did a pregnancy registry based on I just described. So they received 100 for 5 years period. They received 120 reports, and then the sponsor followed those women, and only 57 of those women had a known pregnancy outcome. So that means whether we know they have a live birth or a stillbirth or whatever the outcome is. So this is a significant percentage of loss follow-up. So what we did at that time, we know we don't want to do the traditional pregnancy registry. So we were considering using existing data sources to do this study. So if we use existing data sources to do this registry, that would be more like the graph here. So all the patients would go to the care on the normal, the real-world setting. And then we use existing data source to collect the data on the exposure as well as the outcome. At that time, that was great timing. That's because the use of electronic health databases for pregnancy studies was evolving. VSD did a methodology study to develop and testing algorithm for gestation age and to capture pregnancy outcome. And then present at the same time, they were designing a study using Sentinel database to evaluate influenza vaccines and the birth outcome. So we take advantage of what they were doing and designed our study. So we evaluate two data sources. One is VSD, and another one is PRISM. So originally we wanted to use VSD. It's because the VSD is uses electronic health records, and all the medical encounters are available. However, after we did the sample size calculation, all those we decided VSD won't have enough sample size for our study. So we changed to PRISM. So because PRISM has a much larger population, and also PRISM has its own challenge, but we decided probably this is given the uptake of Trememba vaccine, we think the PRISM database or PRISM is a better way to move forward. So objective for Trememba pregnancy study is to estimate the incidence and the risk ratio of pregnancy outcomes in women exposed and not exposed, so we have a comparison group to Trememba up to 28 days prior to or during the pregnancy. The outcome of interest, that's mean endpoint, is spontaneous abortion and stillbirth. And then we also want to estimate the risk of stillbirth and the spontaneous abortion in the women exposed or not exposed to Trememba up to 28 days prior or during pregnancy. The endpoint here is major congenital abnormality. So this is a scheme of the study design. So what we did is using the Sentinel program, PRISM, the women we would have women exposed to Trememba and not exposed to Trememba. So there are two groups, study groups, and then they will be followed in the database, and they either have outcome of interest for both groups. exposed to treatment, but they will have outcome interest, or they don't have outcome interest. And then for non-treatment but not exposed group, they may develop outcome interest. They may not develop outcome interest. And then we would compare the rates, the rates of those two groups in terms of outcome of interest. So the timeline for this study, we designed this study in 2014 and started the study in 2015. The first 5 years, because the uptake of Trememba vaccine is slow, this is what we expected. So first 5 years, we just observed the coverage of the vaccine first, and as well as counts of the outcome of interest. If we think we accumulate enough number of the outcomes of interest, we expect most likely would be in 2021 or 2022. At that time, we would do the analysis to compare the exposed group outcomes between exposed group and the non-exposed group. So here, I will just, this is a study algorithm. This one take-home point is that we need to pregnancy study using existing database. You can't just take the ICD codes for gestation age or even outcomes of interest as face value. So what we do is that for the gestational age, we use the algorithm that developed and tested by BSD and PRISM, and to estimate the gestation age is pretty much complicated. That's just for live birth. And then for the stillbirth or multiple birth, and for other outcomes, other type of birth, we have to, based on the live birth algorithm, we have to test and develop our own algorithm. So, and then if we, based on the ICD code, we identify the event of interest, which is the spontaneous abortion, and then we will go back to the data provider for validation of the outcome. So basically to go back to the medical chart and see whether that event is captured in the database. That is going to be the same for the birth outcome. That is for major congenital abnormality. That is if we ICD code identify those events, and then we will go back to medical chart to identify those events, to verify those events. So for our study also have some limitations and strengths. I think the main challenge that, before we talk about the limitations and strengths, I would like to talk about the challenges using electronic databases. I think from operational wise, the main challenge would be those algorithms. You have to, because of the algorithm, you have to test it, and you have to go back to the medical chart to validate those codes. Sometimes those medical charts may not be available. That's because in the US, we have the national health insurers. So those charts may not be available because there's layers of approval, or we couldn't access it. However, for those regional insurers, such as Kaiser, that's not a problem. We can get pretty much 90% of those charts validated. So when you do the database, when you do the validation, that's something you need to keep in mind. What percentage of the chart you will be available? That is one. And even you have a great data source out there, some of those partners may not be interested in the study. For our study, the Sentinel has 18 data partners, and we reach out all of them. Only 9 of them are interested in the study, but several of them are not interested. 2 of them are large data providers. So that's further decrease the number of your sample size. So that is something you also need to keep in mind. So especially when the event is very rare, you have a large population in the existing data source, and then because of various reasons, the patients ended up in your study will be much smaller than whatever the database already showed you. So for the strengths of our pregnancy study, definitely is still large sample size. In US, is still very large sample size, and we can the electronic databases. The biggest advantages can identify multiple pregnancy outcomes other than just live birth. And for the comparison group, we didn't pick comparison group because they're already there. So we can set a certain inclusion and exclusion criteria to find, we think, the most appropriate comparison group. For US data, we can link to mother and infants. But there are also challenges in this area because sometimes in the US, there's no social security number for babies when they're just born. So you have to rely on link mother's last name and children's date of birth or mother's children's last name. And this is also complicated, at least in US. So the limitation, as I pointed out, even you have the larger population, you still, the data is not created for research purpose. So all those codes, ICD codes, whatever codes you use, is not complete. And you cannot take them as a face value. You need to, in some way, need to validate them. If you don't have resources to validate all the outcome of interest, you probably can take some of them, one or two, to do validation. So validation of the outcome of interest is very important. So next case study is called Monitoring Real-World Prevnar 13 Safety in China. That is a population-based cohort study used with hybrid data collection methods and outcome validation. So electronic health database in China has been rapidly growing since 2011. There are three major types of EHDs in China. EHRs from inpatient and outpatient care in the hospital, national claims databases, and population-based community EHRs. Because this is related to vaccine, so for those of you not familiar with vaccine in China, there are two types of vaccines in China, type 1 and type 2. So type 1 vaccines are mandatory and provided for children by the government free of charge. Type 2 vaccines are basically voluntary, and the people have to pay it out of their own pocket. All type 1 and type 2 vaccines are administered at China CDC immunization clinics. So Prevnar 13 vaccine was approved in China in October 2016 for prevention of invasive disease caused by S. pneumoniae in infants and children aged 6 weeks old to 15 months. Prevnar 13 is recommended of 4-dose series. So dose one dose at each of those ages, 2, 4, 6, and booster dose would be 12 and 15 months. So based on the risk management plan, we have some known and potential risks of fever, convulsion, and anaphylaxis, and apnea. So this study is designed to address the CMDA to fulfill Prevnar 13 key monitoring requirements. requirement. So this is the population-based combination, prospective and retrospective study design. We have two studies. One is a main study, which we use existing data sources in the Ningbo, the Yingzhou EHR of Ningbo City in China. And we also have a validation study, including two components. The first one is a prospective cohort within the main study. The second is to validate the outcome of interest in the main study. The population include the children 1 to 24 months receiving Provenance 13 in Yingzhou EHR database between May 1st, 2017 and July 24th, 2020. So the objectives I just listed here, we are interested in the 5 outcomes. The first is a febrile seizure, seizure, and febrile seizure, apnea, urticaria, and angina and fever. So the risk period is 0 to 10 days, or 0 to 7 days after vaccination of Provenance 13. Here is the figure to show Yingzhou EHR. Yingzhou is one of the largest districts of Ningbo City, Zhejiang Province. Yingzhou EHR started to collect its residents' medical data since 2005. By 2008, it covers all the medical encounters in its residents within hospitals and clinical and community health centers in the district. So in the district, they have 5 hospitals and 24 community health centers. So there are 4 Yingzhou CDC or Yingzhou EHR getting its data from 4 different sources. First is hospital. They have 5 hospitals here, so inpatient and outpatient healthcare data within the Yingzhou District Hospital. And then the healthcare data, outpatient healthcare data from a community health center. CDC data, that is the immunization record, and AEFI system. Another one is the only women and children's hospital in Ningbo City. They also integrated all those the healthcare data from those 4 data sources. Then the data is available in near real time. This is a flowchart for the study population. So the patients, the children, they are not patients. If they are aged 1 to 24 months, they would be eligible for the study. They have to expose, for main study, they have to expose for at least 1 dose of Provenance 13 between this period. And otherwise they won't be eligible for the study. And in order to be eligible for the prospective cohort study in a subpopulation, and they have to receive the first dose during July 1st, 2018, and July 24th, 2020. And then once they are eligible for the prospective cohort study, then they will have to sign an informed consent in order to participate in the prospective cohort study. The reason we conducted this prospective cohort study is to validate the outcomes, outcome of soft outcomes such as fever, because in EHRs, fever are not well captured, and also we don't know the degree of fever. And second is that for urticaria, we have mild urticaria and severe urticaria. So prospective cohort will allow us to collect the true incidence of urticaria, including mild and severe. So this is one of the main purposes for the prospective subgroup prospective cohort study. So for validation study, we have two components, as I mentioned. First is prospective cohort components. So when they are participating in the prospective cohort, and they will report, they complete a survey. The survey will be baseline survey for each dose, a baseline survey, and then have follow-up survey. Day 7. For each dose, we do follow-up survey. So once, if this report, children receive medical care for safety outcome of interest, and then we will abstract data from medical chart, and then those information would go to the adjudication committee, and the adjudicated outcome would end up in the validation database. Eventually, will be entered into the main study database. So for the outcome evaluation, for the main study, we use ICD-10 code to identify the safety outcome of interest 5. And then we use a data abstraction form to abstract the information from a medical chart, and then send the information to adjudication committee. Then adjudication committee would just adjudicate the outcome. Then the results would end up, adjudicated outcome would end up in the validation database. In terms of strengths and limitations of our study, the main strength is that we use in the population-based community EHR. So all medical encounters are available. And also we monitoring the safety in the real-world setting. And another one would be, for us, most important is to validate the outcomes, safety outcome of interest through two methods. One is prospective cohort, and another one is the validated ICD code for the ICD codes in the main study. For me, the main limitation is the population still is small for Yinzhou CDC because they only have 1.8 million. Prevalence 13 in China, at least in Yinzhou, has pretty good coverage. It's about now it's about 18%. However, it still doesn't allow us to do more. We think it's to do the more sophisticated analysis, which Patricia is going to introduce, talk about more, like self-case control intervals, those kind of analysis. But we plan to do that if we have enough sample size. And so that's the main limitation from my perspective. But also there's another limitation, is like potential misclassification. Before we designed this study, we did a pilot study to evaluate the Yinzhou EHR database. We realized that there are some miscoding of ICD codes. So, and by doing the validation study, will allow us to evaluate the magnitude of those miscoding or undercoding of some the codes we use to identify outcomes, safety outcome of interest. The last one, in terms of compounding by co-administration of vaccine, that's not happen in Yinzhou EHR because the feedback from the clinic, immunization clinic is that they do not co-administer type 2 vaccines together. So that means if we study type 2 vaccine using Yinzhou EHR, that's not going to be a concern. But in the US, that would be a concern. Any questions? That's all of my presentation. Thank you. Yes. I apologize for the technical issue.
Thank you, Frank May from Australia. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm wondering if you could tell us the difference between ineligible and eligible people who actually enter your validation study.
You mean ineligible for the process? Because we have two...
If the slides will allow you to go back to the validation study scheme. There was one slide in which you had validation study, and the first division was to ineligible and eligible. I'm wondering if you can tell us who was eligible and who was ineligible.
Okay, so so for eligible population for the prospective cohort, they have to receive the first dose of Prevalent 13 during this period. But there are some patients that they receive second dose or third dose during this period, they are not eligible for the prospective cohort.
Thank you. It was a question which I understand that Prevnar is considered a type 2 vaccination.
Yes.
And finally, if I may ask, the question of co-administration of other vaccines, and in your small pilot study, the extent to which other vaccines were being given to children at 2 months, 4 months, and so on. It usually happens, and these outcomes, which are negative adverse effects, it is when it's talking about fever and urticaria and so on in small children. These are very normally prevalent conditions from viral or other conditions which children naturally suffer. So this question of the specificity of this measure for your vaccine, it was the question in my mind when you discussed that point, but you have already got pilot data. So I wonder a little more information about this pilot data, excluding just normal viral infection and so on for small children who receive Prevnar or not.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So first, I answer your first question regarding co-administration of other vaccine. Based on our pilot study, the result, because we use let me tell you, the pilot study, we observed the co-administration type 2 vaccine, type 2 and type 1 vaccine together. So, but a very small percentage. So this is why we put as a limitation. And then the studies are going. And then we had an investigator meeting with they call the immunization doctors, and they told me they do not co-administer type 1 and type 2 vaccines together, and no type 2 vaccines together. So, and I hope I answered your question correctly.
Yes, thank you. You have answered the question.
Part of your question.
You have answered the question. Thank you very much. Did you consider having a parallel group that you could look at of children who did not receive Prevnar at the same age for the kinds of urticaria, temperature, and so on for small children, such prevalent conditions? One wonders about the specificity of this particular outcome in your study.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful study. I don't mean, just a question. Thank you.
We did. Actually, for the pilot study, we did. And I'm going to present the results tomorrow. But not fever, because the fever is not coded. I would say poorly coded, so we didn't include fever, but we include majority of the outcome of interest here. Exactly. I think from my perspective, I think the best approach would be self-paced control, risk interval, if you want to see there's a true signal or not. We had a lot of internal discussion in terms of what is the best design. Given the sample size, but we hope we have enough sample size and then we can do the self-case control and then to see at least for some outcomes whether there's a true signal or not. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much for very good presentation. I am Kiyoshi from Japan, and I think to have complete records of vaccination, it's sometimes challenging in many studies in many countries because vaccination is not really a usual treatment recorded in the healthcare system. And if my memory is correct, you said in the limitation, if the children are vaccinated outside the catchment area, I may be missed. But does this mean if the children are vaccinated inside the catchment area, the record is 100% complete? Could you give me some relevant information?
Okay, I think to study vaccine in China, it's relatively, in certain ways, relatively easier in terms of capture vaccination data because all type 1, type 2 vaccines are vaccinated at CDC clinics. So they have the best data. China has the best, I would say the best immunization record compared to other countries. And that's first. And second, at least for Yinzhou CDC, that for this study, we are going to use a barcode date instead of the day they enter the barcode, they scan the barcode as a Prevnar 13 vaccination date. But for the pilot study, we use the date of vaccine to use entered by the vaccine doctors. So I think it would be very, very rare. I would say close to impossible if someone vaccinated outside of CDC clinics.
Thank you very much. It looks like China is the ideal place to study vaccine.
Yeah, I think so. But the challenge is that it's difficult to link. You have to the local CDC or prevention CDC or country CDC, whatever, are willing to share the data with other data partners. So that is a major challenge.
You have skipped the challenge. I have one question. Is there a particular reason why you chose the Yinzhou district over all the areas in China? Because would the results of this study conducted in Yinzhou district be representative of the whole area in China?
That's a very good question because for type 2 vaccines are paid by parents or paid by whoever is going to receive the vaccine. So still considered expensive. So the only, I would say, families financially well off maybe afford those vaccines. Yinzhou is one of the biggest districts of Ningbo city. Ningbo is developed financially well off city or economically well off city. I would say it would be the results of the data can be generalized to the population, like children population that receive Prevnar 13 treatment. It's unlikely. I think for children living in third tier or fourth tier cities in China may have limited exposure to Prem 13. Most likely would be first tier or second tier from first and second tier. That's a very good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. The last question, because we have other speakers. Yeah. Yes, please.
PCV study vaccination, because in China there are long discussions from both the NAMI group or the social media regarding the safety and adverse effect of vaccines. So my question is, in the prospective study design, how will you assess the relationship, the cause and effect relationship between the vaccine use and adverse effect? And another question is about the sample size, because you have also mentioned in your presentation, even with the registration database or the large database, the sample size may not be sufficient to identify very rare AE or rare AE. So what's the ideal sample size to make this judgment? Or are you going to do some other studies in other areas which can use as a continuing study or follow-up study to make the decision or judgment on the adverse effect? Thank you.
Yeah, I think to answer your question in terms of sample size, so definitely for febrile seizure and seizure, we don't have okay, when we talk about sample size, we definitely first think about hypothesis testing. For the primary objective for our study is not hypothesis testing, but still we need an estimated incidence of safety outcome for interest. So still, it's a concern. Yes, for febrile seizure, definitely we don't. And in terms of, actually, like Frank already asked some similar questions in terms of your suggestion, different population. We did a pilot study, so it's a much larger sample size. That will show us the incidence of febrile seizure in the Yinzhou children in a similar age group. What is the background rate? So if we don't have enough sample size to do the do the hypothesis testing, but we can contextualize our results based on the results from pilot study.
Good morning, everyone. So first, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me here and give this presentation. I'm Ting Wu from Xiamen University. So today I will share with you some of our experience in post-licensure clinical study of our recombinant hepatitis E vaccine. So the hepatitis E vaccine, HE239, with a brand name Hecalin. It is the first and the only licensed hepatitis E vaccine in the world currently. So our institute in Xiamen University, together with Innovax, a vaccine manufacturer in Xiamen, we together developed the vaccine after 14 years development. And the vaccine was licensed in 2011 in China. It was marketed on the market in 2012. Until now, it is only licensed in China, and we have passed the audit from the Pakistan FDA, and hopefully this vaccine will license in Pakistan at the end of this year or early next year. So first, I would like to briefly introduce the background of this disease. HEV is the leading cause of acute viral hepatitis globally, especially in Southeast Asia and Africa. It is the second or the first most important cause of acute hepatitis in adults. And in this area, and in Europe, now more and more autochthonous hepatitis E cases were reported. And in the United States, as currently there is not a licensed HEV test reagent in the market, so clinically they do not test for HEV infection in the hepatitis patients. So very little cases were reported in the United States. And here is data from the WHO. So every year there were more than 20 million HEV infections with 3 million clinical cases and 56,000 HEV-related deaths. And globally, there were outbreaks of hepatitis E with tens of thousands of cases in recent half century. The biggest one is in Xinjiang, China, with 119,000 cases. And in China, HEV infection has exceeded HIV infection to be the #1 cause of acute viral hepatitis since 2012. And now the using of diagnostic assay for HEV is only 20% of that of HAV reagent. That means the disease burden of hepatitis E is still being underestimated. And the mortality rate is higher for HEV than HAV infection. The mortality of acute hepatitis E in general population is around 0.5 to 4% worldwide. But there were some high-risk populations. Because in the phase 3 clinical trial, we usually only consider the relatively healthy population. And in post-licensure clinical study, we would consider more for this specific population. And the high-risk population include the pregnant women, old people, patients with liver disease patients, and immunocompromised patients such as HIV carriers or the solid organ transplanted patient, and children and children to highly endemic area. So in the pregnant women, the mortality rate is more than 20% after they contract hepatitis E. And these are data from the Donghai, is our surveillance data. The morbidity in the old people is higher than younger people. HEV infection in younger people more tended to be subclinical infection, but in old people it would more likely to be a symptomatic infection. And for the mortality in HEV superinfected, decompensated chronic liver disease patients are higher than HEV non-infected. And for usually after HEV infection, the hepatitis C tend to be acute hepatitis, but in HIV carriers or in some kind of immunocompromised patients, the infection might tend to be chronic infection. This is a paper published in AJM, and these people has abnormal ALT for more than 2 years. So in phase 3 clinical trial, we only enrolled healthy adults aged 16 to 65, and we totally 112,000 participants were randomized to receive the HEV vaccine or the control HPV vaccine. and we followed them after the 3 doses of vaccination. We followed them for another 1 year and get enough acute hepatitis cases, and we use this data for the licensure of this vaccine. So so in the phase 4 clinical trial, we need to consider the long-term efficacy, long-term immunopersistence of this vaccine, and the long-term safety of this vaccine, and also the efficacy, immunogenicity, and safety of this vaccine in some specific population, and the optimized immunization schedule, especially in outbreaks or for those travelers who wish to get immunized in a very short period, and the co-administration with other vaccines. So we designed several studies to try to answer all these questions. So we have designed several phase 4 clinical studies for this vaccine. Some have been finished, and some of them is ongoing. So the first is the long-term efficacy, immunopersistence, and safety study of this heparin. This is the extended follow-up study of our phase 3 clinical trial. As I have mentioned, the phase 3 is 19 months, and after that, we kept follow all these people for another 8 years, and now we have followed them for 10 years. We finished this study at the end of last year. We have the data of the 10 years after vaccination. So for the safety, long-term safety data, we get the personal report from the participants, and from the report from the village doctors, and also we get the data from the local medical insurance system. And for the efficacy, long-term efficacy data, we have set up a very sensitive hepatitis surveillance system locally. I will introduce later. And for the immunopersistent data, we took the blood from the participants in the immunogenicity subset every year. We take them every year, around 10,000 participants from two townships. So totally we have 10 townships locally. So the trial was conducted in Jiangsu province, in Dongtai city. So we are here in Xi'an, and Dongtai is in Jiangsu, north of Shanghai. We enrolled participants from 10 townships from Dongtai. And we have set up a sensitive hepatitis surveillance system in Dongtai. We have several sentinel clinics, 162 community clinic centers, and 11 hospitals in townships, and some 30 personal clinics. And also we have 2 central hospitals in Dongtai city. And all the doctors in these sentinel clinics were trained, and for those villagers who were fatigued or loss of appetite for more than 3 days, they were requested to take blood. So those who were fatigued and loss of appetite for more than 3 days, they were called suspected hepatitis cases. And the blood sample would be sent to a local Dongtai CDC, and it will be tested for ALT. If his ALT is higher than 2.5 times of upper limit of normal ULN. They will be typed for hepatitis. They will test it for HAV IgM, HCV IgG, HBV IgM, and HEV IgM, HEV IgG. So if he has if his HEV IgM is positive, and then the patient would be followed up in 2 or 3 weeks, and the blood sample would also be tested for ALT. And the patient would be kept follow up every 2 to 3 weeks until its ALT became normal. So we have serial blood sample of the patients. And all this serum sample would be sent to Xiamen University to our lab, and we will detect the HEV markers, HEV IgM, HEV IgG, and IgG quantitative analysis, and also HEV RNA, and to further diagnose of these patients. Also, we have designed a website to enter all this data, and to do data analysis and some quality control. So this system covered the 400,000 people in this 10 townships. Among them, 110,000 people were the participants in our phase 3 clinical trial. And also we have software to collect the fingerprint of each of the participants in our phase 3 clinical trial. And also we have their photo and recorded in our software. So during the follow-up for those hepatitis cases, we would confirm their identity through the fingerprint and their photo. And also we would compare the data of each year, the number of suspected hepatitis patients and those who have abnormal ALT, and the number of confirmed hepatitis cases. We would analyze all this data to make sure the system is highly qualified. And through this system, we have get the long-term efficacy data of this vaccine, and we have published the data until month 56 after the vaccination, and published the data in New England Journal of Medicine. So the efficacy is very high. In per protocol set, it's 93%, and in the intention to treat set, it's 86%. And also we get the immunopersistence data. And also we have reported the safety data of Hecolin to the Global Advisory Committee on Vaccine Safety. And they think the safety data of this vaccine is reassuring. So this is the study in elderly people. In phase 3, we enrolled participants aged from 16 to 65. Although the vaccine was approved to be used in people older than 16 years old, we still lack the immunogenicity and safety data of this vaccine in those who are older than 65. So we conduct this trial in those who are older than 65 in Zhejiang province. This is an open label study. And we have 3 groups. Totally, the sample size is 600. So we have 3 groups. One group is the elderly people. They received the 3 doses of Hecolin. It's a test group. And the second group is the immunogenicity control group. We enrolled 200 participants aged 18 to 65 as an immunogenicity control group. And also we enrolled 200 elderly people aged older than 65 as a safety control group. These people, they did not receive any intervention, any vaccination, but they were requested to fill all the safety diary card during the 7 months, the 6 months of vaccination, same as this group. So this is a safety control group. And this study is finished. We have submitted the paper to journals. And this is a study in chronic hepatitis B patients in Shandong province. Because I have said the hepatitis super infection of HB, super HB infection in baseline chronic liver disease patients. The prognosis would be very poor. So we conducted this study. This is also an open label study. And we have 2 groups. The first is the healthy this is the control group, the healthy volunteers with negative HBsAg and negative HBe IgM and negative HBe IgG. And for the chronic hepatitis B patients, they were positive. They have positive HBsAg. And their ALT is less than 1.5 upper limit of normal. And they have negative HBe IgM and IgG. So all of them received 3 doses of heparin. And they were analysis for the liver function at month 1, month 0, month 6, before the first and the third dose, and at month 7, and at 1 month after the third dose, to analysis the impact of this vaccine to the liver function of these hepatitis B patients. And this is a study for the co-administration with recombinant hepatitis B vaccines. This is a randomized open label study in Beijing, in Caoyang CDC. And these people were randomized to receive the together with HE vaccine and HPV vaccine. And another group received HPV vaccine only, and the third group received HPV vaccine only. To analyze the immunogenicity and safety in this population. And this is the accelerated vaccine trial. So this is conducted in Zhejiang CDC. And this is a randomized open label study. We enrolled participants older than 18 years old and received 3 doses of heparin at 0, 7, and 21 day. Means they received the vaccine at 0, 1, and 3 weeks. And the other group received the vaccine at the regular schedule at 0, 1, and 6 months. So we try to analyze to compare the safety and immunogenicity of the accelerated vaccination schedule compared with the standard vaccination schedule. And this is a study in pregnant women because the mortality of hepatitis E in pregnant women is very high, it's more than 20%. So this is a very important target population of HPV vaccine vaccination. But in China, it's very difficult to conduct such kind of study. And an institute, the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research, ICDRB in Bangladesh, they applied for funding from the Norway government and they were supported with more than 5 million US dollars to conduct this study. So this is a randomized, controlled, double-blinded study. It is now ongoing. They enrolled healthy women aged 16 years to 39 years. They were non-pregnant at enrollment. They were randomized to receive the HPV vaccine happily or the control HPV vaccine every 6 months. The sample size is 20,000. So they would like to analyze the effectiveness of this vaccine in preventing HPV disease during pregnancy. So at enrollment they were non-pregnant then, and they will analyze the efficacy of this vaccine during pregnancy after they have been vaccinated. So these are the news on their website. So the third part is the pharmacovigilance. The company are responsible for this part of work. Because we are preparing for the pre-qualification PQ of this vaccine. We're preparing for the WHO pre-qualification. So we invite some experts from PAS to give us some comments to set up our pharmacovigilance system. So we have set up all this. We have building all these blocks for efficient quality system for pharmacovigilance, including the PV contact person for communicating at the national level, and we have set up the organization and the operation unit for PV, and training the PV staff, and all the colleagues in the company. Our sources of data is the AEFI report system and the ADR monitoring system in China, and also the data from the complaint system, from the users of the vaccine or from the salespeople of the company. And also we have the monitor performance of PV system and the record management and data retention. And the documentation of all the quality system and also the auditing of this PV system. So we have set up all these blocks and try to improve them. And so now we have established an independent pharmacovigilance system with the support from PAS. And for each step of the pharmacovigilance, we have set up the relative SOPs for each step of this work. And now we have some major challenges for the PV system. The lack of robust and validated PV system, and we lack of expertise to perform pharmacovigilance activities both in the domestic and the international market. And we lack of policy support. We have difficulties in integration of data from different vigilance systems. Also, there are some challenges in integration of the PV into public health programs. For this part of a job, we are working on it, and we try to improve it. Okay, that's all for my talk. Thank you.
My name is Hanol Jong. I'm from Korea. My question is, for all your RCTs, your first inclusion criteria were healthy adults. Is there a particular criteria that has to be met to be considered healthy?
Sorry.
Is there a particular criteria or specific conditions to be classified as healthy?
You mean in the phase 3 clinical trial?
Yes.
We have inclusion and exclusion criteria. We have very detailed inclusion and exclusion criteria, and we would because this is a clinical trial of a vaccine, we would not have a physical examination for each participant. So we judged whether it is healthy through the investigators will ask them several questions, and according to the inclusion and the exclusion criteria, if he meets the inclusion criteria and unmet the exclusion criteria, he was thought as healthy, relatively healthy.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, so my name is Sarah Welder from GSK in Belgium. So maybe I missed it during your presentation, but you were talking about the pharmacovigilance system that you've set up in China, if I'm correct?
Please slowly.
Sorry. So maybe I missed it in the presentation, but you were mentioning the pharmacovigilance system that you set up in China with the support of PATS, correct?
Yeah, because yes, we are preparing for the WHO PQ, so we invite some experts from PATS to help us to improve our PV system.
Yeah. My question then is, what are the data sources that because in your blogs, you had different blogs, and one of the blogs is you mentioned that you were looking at different data sources for the pharmacovigilance. So my question is, what are the data sources that you were looking for? Is it like electronic health records and claims data? Is there anything else that you included?
Yes. Our data source from the AEFI report system. It is from the CDC, and also from the ADR monitoring system, and also we have the 400 telephone. The compliance system from the vaccine users or from the salespeople of the company.
Right. Okay. And for the integration, do you mean like merging the different data between them, or just you append all the data together?
Sorry, this part of job was responsible by Innovex. In fact, I do not know the details of this work.
Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, maybe I'll take you during the break. Okay, thank you.
So while we are setting up the slides, I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Patricia Sadier. I work at Merck. And my topic today is, thank you very much. This one for that. Thank you. To go quickly over some self-control characteristics of vaccine safety studies. So I don't know if we can go a little over time because I only have 15 minutes, it sounds, with what's left. But we'll do what we can with this time. So I'm just going to give a little background on self-control design and then present the top two kind of most popular self-control designs. So self-control, understand it as meaning using the subject as their own control, using people as their own control. That's basically what self-control means. Some characteristics make vaccine really suitable for self-control studies, and they've been used in safety of vaccine for many, many years, and start being used on the drug side now. And that's not unusual for vaccines to be at the forefront of methods that have been designed for vaccines initially and refined little by little going to the drug side. So vaccines, as you know, you all were vaccinated as kids. They are broadly used, and ideally you would want almost everybody to get vaccinated for vaccines that are preventing infectious diseases in healthy people. And as a result, it becomes difficult sometimes to find unvaccinated people for your comparison, or they are kind of weird unvaccinated people because the reason why they weren't vaccinated make them special and different. So the large number of exposed vaccinated people is one characteristic of vaccine safety studies. The exposure, on the other hand, is relatively simple. It's usually a single dose, or sometimes just 2 or 3 doses, a few months apart, so a very easy exposure compared to the drug, for example, exposure. And vaccine information is usually well recorded, well captured in different ways, vaccination booklet cards, etc. So you have this information on the exposure pretty handy. On the event outcome side, we're going to call it health outcomes of interest, HOI, in this presentation. Typically, we focus on events that are both acute and brief. So they start shortly after the vaccination, and you'll see we'll talk about risk windows a little bit. Usually, this risk window is short, a few days, a few weeks after the vaccine. And the relevant risk window, which we'll discuss a little bit, it depends on both the outcome and the vaccine. Sometimes for the same outcome, different vaccines, you would expect the outcome to occur at different times after the vaccine, and we'll see a couple of examples as well. And they usually also resolve quickly, they are brief, which gives you an opportunity in a short period of time to observe several of them. Assuming these occurrences of the same outcome are independent, meaning like the risk of having a second one is not related to the fact that you had the first one, then you can use all of them actually in your study. And we'll see also that to use meaningfully a self-control design, it's better if this event is also not a contraindication to the vaccine. But there are ways to go around that if it is. So this is kind of a general graph of self-control design that we'll go over because that's the basic graph that we're going to use. The pointer. So typically, you have what we call the risk interval or risk window, which is a time period that you determine during which, after the vaccine, if the event occurs, you consider that it's more likely to be related to the vaccine. So a period during which it makes sense from a biological standpoint and everything you know about the vaccine, to consider that the event may be related to the vaccine, if it occurs there. And then the rest of the period could be used as a control period. Typically, you use the period that is after the vaccine, a control interval that is post-vaccination. And since you don't always really know when exactly, it's pretty arbitrary to determine your risk window. If you say it's 30 days, if something happens on day 31, is it really in the comparison or is it still in the risk window? Sometimes you implement what's called a washout period, so a period during which you don't consider that the events that occur then belong to either the risk or the comparison window. So washout period is optional, but often done. And then you have an issue with this short period of time here before the vaccine, during which you think if, for example, the kid is sick during that time period, it's unlikely that the kid would get a vaccine at the time he is or she is sick. So there's this time period during which you think that if the kid really got the vaccine here, it probably was a healthy kid right before getting the vaccine. And that's called the healthy vaccinee period, which is usually also a period that you don't use as a comparison period. You exclude it from the comparison period. So if you want to use the time period before the vaccination, you use a pre-vaccination control interval that is before that healthy vaccinee period. And sometimes it's hard to determine how long this healthy vaccinee period will be. It depends on the outcome, and it's a little bit arbitrary. So some people prefer completely not to use a pre-vaccination comparison period at all, and just use the post-vaccination time as comparison. So some of the key features of self-controlled design is that inherently they control for everything that is fixed in the person that is vaccinated. So any medical history is the same before or after vaccination, right after vaccination, and in the comparison period. Everything that's fixed is automatically controlled for. You've seen in the previous presentation that sometimes there's a real struggle to find a comparison group that would look like the vaccinated group. Because it's hard to match people on everything that they may be different on. So that takes care of it, self-control takes care of it. What it doesn't take care of is things that may change over time. For example, age, if your risk and comparison windows are apart from a few months apart, that may be sufficient for some outcomes that have a very different incidence by age. Say the first year of life, there may be very different incidence of febrile convulsion. In the second year of life, very different incidence of intraception. We'll see that for rotavirus in the first year of life. So these influences, these you need to take care and to take into account when you do the analysis, and you need to adjust for these differences. Changing age, same thing for seasonality. If your outcome is more frequent, for example, in the winter time, when when kids have a lot of fever, they may have more febrile convulsion, then you would have to also adjust for that. But everything else is kind of taken care of, so that's kind of nice. Risk window, this is an important aspect of any safety study design. You choose it very wisely depending on what exactly you want to study. And even the same outcome, like a febrile convulsion, you may use a different time window of interest risk window depending on the vaccine that you are studying. So for example, you would expect a febrile convulsion to occur within a couple of days of a vaccine containing pertussis. As if you look at a measles containing vaccine, the febrile convulsion will occur more likely around the time the measles vaccine strain replicates, around a week after the vaccine. So the time period that you would be interested in is more around a week after the vaccine. So same outcome, different risk window. So it has to be biologically sound the way you choose the risk window. But that's true for any safety study. You use the day of vaccination as your index day, but as we said, typically this information is fairly available and accurate. On the outcome side, you look, so in this graph that we have, you look for the occurrence of the events after vaccination in the risk window and in the comparison period, and you compare basically the incidence or the occurrence of these events. You can also look at multiple events if you want in the same study. You can even do what we call fishing expedition or general safety, which has studies that are done relatively commonly after a new vaccine is licensed and put on the market, to have real-world safety data and detect rare events that may not have been detected during clinical trials. So you could look at all the events, for example, that result in hospitalization or ED visit, if you wanted, and compare their occurrence in the risk window versus the comparison window. That's also a nice way of doing general safety. So self-control, again, can be used for that. So this is the example of the first kind of common self-control study design that is used. It's called self-control risk interval. That's a PRISM nomenclature. You heard about PRISM before. So it's kind of like a cohort study, and you include all the vaccinated people in your study. Everybody you know was vaccinated, so it's a good study to do if you have good information on the vaccine status of people. And so you include them when they are vaccinated, you look at whether they have the events during the risk period, and you compare to your self-comparison period, usually a post-vaccination period. So you use only the vaccinated people. That's an advantage of this design. And typically, only the vaccinated cases, so the subjects who were vaccinated and had an event, will contribute to the analysis. So that's relatively cost efficient in terms of design. Once you have all your vaccinated, you have to identify the cases. And as was mentioned in previous presentations, the validation of the case is also an important aspect of these studies, but that's true again for any study. So in this design, basically you self-match the risk control intervals. Each subject contributes one risk interval and one or more control intervals, usually again post-vaccination, but if you want, you can use the pre-vaccination if you're sure this will not introduce any bias. You can assess multiple occurrences of the event if these occurrences are independent of each other. And again, this self-control design will take care of time-fixed confounders, but not age or seasonality, which you will have to control for in addition. And then you do a match analysis. So one example of that is a study that was published, part of PRISM studies, of intraception, which is it's intestinal invagination that can occur in young children and has been described after rotavirus vaccination with a slightly increased risk of intraception after rotavirus vaccination. So there was several large studies have been done to look at this risk, more focused risk on intraception. And in this design, classically, you took all your children vaccinated with the vaccine and looked at whether they developed intraception within either the risk or the comparison period, and then analyzed this data. In that particular study, the authors looked at two different risk windows, the first 7 days and the first 21 days. And they used a control interval of 21 days immediately starting after the risk window. So no washout period if you want. So we'll see examples of the other very popular self-control design. It's called self-control case series methods. So as much as the first one was more like a cohort type of study, this one is more like a case control study. So you start with the cases and you identify all of the cases that occur within a pre-specified time period. So if you want, you can pre-specify that time period as being 1 year. Could be the year 2018. All of the cases that occurred in 2018, or it could be an age time period. It could be the second year of life, for example. So you pre-specify your time period and you identify all of the cases that occurred during your period of observation. And then among the cases, you assess their vaccine status. The advantage of this design is that you only need to assess the vaccine status of the cases. So if you deal with an outcome that is relatively rare, where you don't have too many cases to evaluate and confirm, and you have a hard time having the vaccine information, this is a very economical design where the vaccine information will only be needed among the cases. And you determine basically on this, if you go back to this, you determine whether when the subjects receive the vaccine. So you have the cases, and then you determine when the vaccine doses were received. You could have received several during that period of observation, and you have pre-specified your risk window, and then you look at whether this case occurred during the risk window or not. So it's kind of a case control design. You start with the cases, and you look at exposure or not. And you use your entire period of observation to do your analysis. So, same thing, so you define your period of observation, and the self-control design will take care of the fixed confounders that you still need to control for age and seasonality if the incidence of your outcome changes with age and seasonality. Something I didn't mention on the rotavirus example, the incidence of intrasusception changes a lot during the first year of life. Very, very different by a week almost of age, so you have to adjust very carefully for age in that example. Let's see if we can go real fast. Again, you can also evaluate multiple exposures if you want, and multiple occurrences of the event of interest. An example. This is an example of how you can try to adjust for either difference in seasonality, for example. You can use the unvaccinated group to look at background rate of your event among unvaccinated people and use that to match, say, month by month, year of follow-up to adjust, for example, for seasonality. If you have an issue with seasonality, for example, for febrile conversion, that will be more frequent in the winter. So you can use your unvaccinated to help adjust for differences in age or in seasonality. This is an example of a self-control case series that was done already 10 years ago by a group in the UK looking at febrile conversion occurring after MMR vaccine, so very, very classical vaccine. And in that example, they looked at febrile conversion as it could be related to two components of MMR, the measles component, where you would expect febrile conversion or fever to occur more around a week after the vaccine, and the mumps component, where the fever tends to occur more around 3 weeks after the vaccine. So they determined two different risk windows, one around 1 week and one around 3 weeks. And using this design, they looked at all the cases of febrile conversion that they had here during the second year of life, starting at 12 months, ending at 24 months, and looked at when children may have received MMR during that time period, and analyzed that as a matched case control study, pretty much. So there's a large choice of design that can be used to do vaccine safety, and the choice is based on the question that you have, the type of event, and the potential for confounding. We've seen in previous presentation that it's sometimes challenging to find a good comparison group that would be that you would be able to use to compare meaningfully to your vaccinated group without any bias. And basically you can mitigate that by trying to restrict or try to match people. But the self-control design is really a good way of taking care of a lot of the potential confounders if you can use it. Still, it's limited to acute events and brief events. so cannot use it for everything. There are many limitations also, difficult to use for very serious events like death. There are limitations on how you use it for events like that, or that you cannot have several times during your observation period. But it's a good way, it's a good type of design to take care of a lot of confounding at once. And again, as mentioned at the beginning, it has been used in vaccines for many years, and it's starting to be used on the drug side. So again, vaccines are as often at the forefront of methods here. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, and I'm Diana from National Taiwan University. So you mentioned earlier that for studies, self-control studies, the contraindication should, because contraindication prevents patients from receiving the vaccines. So I was wondering, how do you get around this in the rotavirus intersusception study? Like, how do you, because like after it's licensed, I noticed that in the label it does say that intersusception is a contraindication for rotavirus vaccine. So how do you conduct this study?
So I don't know if it's truly a contraindication or simply a precaution, because we've seen a lot of cases where kids who had an episode of intersusception after first dose will get the second dose or the third dose. So you still have the exposure, but if you use the design as was used by PRISM, for example, they only use a post-vaccination comparison period. So in that case, you would not expect a new vaccine there, but you could still see intersusception occurring. So that way you avoid basically using pre-vaccination as a comparison in that case. So you use just a post-vaccination comparison period. And you would not expect to see several vaccinations, like several doses. You'll only have one dose. If it's truly a contraindication, if it's a true contraindication.
Thank you.
Today I will talk about the case crossover, case time control, and case time control in ASIA. My presentation will categorize into two parts. Part 1 will include the concept of 3 case-only design, including case crossover, case time control, and case time control. And I will explain what situation these designs can be considered, which assumptions should be met, and how outcome and exposure should be measured. Part 2 will include a practical example using large claims database. In my case, I will use my example, neuropsychiatric adverse events with the use of oseltamivir. The brand name is Tamiflu used. First of all, case-based design can be categorized into 2 kinds of design. First one is a design started with outcome, and the second one is started with exposure. The second part will be covered by the next speaker, Libby Lovett. And the first design started with outcome, which was derived from any case control, is case crossover. The first one is case crossover, which was developed by Malcolm McClure in 1991. And the second one is case time control, developed by Dr. Sami Suisa in 1995. And the third one is case time control by Shirley Wang in 2011. As 3 case-based design is mainly derived from case control study, I will explain case control study concept at first. When we conduct case control study, we at first conduct the case definition, and we select the controls matched on age, sex, or duration of time, and then we compare the status of exposure between those controls and cases. Case control study may be an answer for questions why not, why me. In this case, why should I be a case compared to control, and which factor made me case? While case control study may be an answer for question why me, case crossover design may be a question for answer why now. For the case crossover design, each individual serves as his or her own control. Each individual provides the exposure information for both hazard and control period. In this case crossover design, hazard period is a very recent period prior to the index date of case, and control period is the very past period of prior to the index date of case. Case crossover design summarized by Malcolm McClure and his colleagues, it may be the answer for why now. Why should I experience such a case now? Some factor, some extraneous factor, or some bad behavior yesterday or last week makes me a case now. So, case crossover design is a scientific way of asking and answering the questions. Was the patient doing anything unusual just before the onset of disease? Also, case crossover design is to study transient effect of brief exposure on the occurrence of new acute onset disease. These designs are to evaluate whether exposure of interest triggers an outcome of interest. These are the example of case crossover. It's not a medication example. I will explain in the next slide using the medication example. The first example is alcohol consumption and injury. The effect of alcohol is very transient. Alcohol use is usually associated with injury. One would expect that the alcohol consumption prior to injury increased the risk of injury. The second example is stress and sudden cardiac death. Physical stress and mental stress may trigger sudden cardiac death, and we would find that sudden cardiac death occurred more frequently during or shortly after strenuous physical activity. These are the all published examples for pharmacoepidemiology field, and these are the pairs of drug and adverse events using case crossover design. Hypnotic drugs and car accident, benzodiazepine use and injury, and tramadol use and acute hypoglycemia, oseltamivir use and neuropsychiatric adverse events, which will be part 2 example, and oral sodium phosphate bowl preparation and acute kidney failure, and short-acting nifedipine and stroke. What is the characteristic of these drugs and adverse outcome? It is brief exposure, transient effect, and acute onset disease. To set the hazard and control period is very important step in case crossover study. Case crossover is a design that compares the exposure to certain agent during the interval when the event does not occur referred as control period, which I previously explained very past period, to the exposure when the event occurred referred as hazard period, which I explained very recent period. Investigator may put the washout period between this hazard and control period to minimize the misclassification, exposure misclassification, and then investigator compare the exposure status between hazard and control period. Analysis in case crossover is almost same as matched case control study. Matched case control study, to estimate the matched odds ratio, only discordant pair contributes to odds ratio. This 2x2 table, exposure plus, D plus, exposure minus, D minus, A and D is concordant pair. In this case, B and C is discordant pair. Matched odds ratio can be calculated by the number of patients B is exposure plus disease minus, divided by C, exposure minus D plus. These are the concept of concordant and discordant pair in case crossover design. In this case, concordant pair, exposure yes in hazard, exposure yes in control period, I colored in that color, and concordant pair, prescription record no, and prescription record no, concordant pair. Discordant pair in case crossover design might be expressed prescription record yes and yes in hazard, no in control, or vice versa. Yes in hazard, no in control. In this case, we can calculate the matched odds ratio B is prescription record yes in hazard, no in control. You can calculate the number of patients of B is 2 divided by 1. Therefore, in this case, we might conclude twofold increased risk of certain medication and outcome of interest. Therefore, matched case control and case crossover shares the same analysis. Matched odds ratio can be, the equation of matched odds ratio is B divided by C. And the case crossover design matched odds ratio is also same, B divided by C, but B is exposed in hazard but not exposed in control. C, not exposed in hazard but exposed in control period. These are the data structure of case control study. Let's compare the next slide. Next slide is the data structure of case crossover design. For the matched case control, every line is based on the patient person ID. Every individual is one line. There are 6 people, patient ID number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the second variable is to differentiate case and control. In this case, cases are coded into 1, controls are coded into 0. And as this data structure is based on the matched case control, there are matched number 1. Patient ID number 1, 2, 3 is designated as matched number 1. Patient number 4, 5, 6 is designated as matched number 2. For conducting matched case control study, conditional registry regression is normally applied to estimate crude and adjusted odds ratio. For the SAS programming, strata option, these matched number third variables can be used. Analysis in case crossover, data structure is very similar, but these have some different points. First of all, first three lines are all patient ID number 1. Patient ID number 1, number 2, number 3. There are no number 3 or number 4. First three line is patient ID number 1, and first line is hazard period 1. And the second line is patient ID number 1, but the control period 1, which was coded into 0. And the third line is control period 2, which was coded into 0. In this case, for the patient ID number 1, exposure was not exposed in hazard period, but exposed in control period, and then exposed in control period 2. For the patient ID number 2, the first line is always hazard period, and the second line is control period 1 and 2. The coding hazard period 1 and 0 are always fixed. And patient ID number 2, exposure was, the drug was exposed in hazard period, but not exposed in control period 1, but exposed in control period 2. Previous data structure and the next case crossover data structure shares the same statistical analysis, conditional registry regression, but for the SAS programming, for the strata option, for probabilistic step, strata option, the patient ID can be act as like matched number in case control study. There are several strengths and limitations of case crossover study. Case crossover study uses only cases, and fixed patient characteristics are controlled by design itself, as case serves as their own controls. Therefore, time invariant characteristic, genetic factor, gender, socioeconomic status, smoking, or lifestyle, we don't have to care about these all time invariant characteristics. But time variant characteristics also remains a confounding issue. So these variables can be modeled by regression models such as co-medication and acute onset comorbidity. However, the limitation of case crossover design is this design is very vulnerable to spurious association between a drug and an outcome owing to temporal trends in drug utilization. These are the points why case time control is suggested by. Case time control is an extension of case crossover design. Case crossover design is vulnerable to time trend of drug utilization. In 1995, the semi-Suiza suggests CTC, case time control design, which collects for time trend of drug use by incorporating a group of patients who did not experience the outcome of interest. Let's imagine what will happen if we found a dramatic increase of drug use. In this case, prior to the acute event, and in this study period, if the prevalence of exposure was less than 1,000 in control period and more than 4,000 in hazard period, what will happen if exposure change over time? The probability of exposure capture will be increased in hazard period, but decreased in control period, and adjusted odds ratio may be increased, and we might induce the overestimated odds ratio. So these are the same slide which you already seen in the case crossover design, and the blue line is previous matched odds ratio. The previous case crossover design matched odds ratio was 2. Let's suppose the blue is a true value, but if in a situation we found a dramatic increase of medication, one of concordant pair might be changed into discordant pair from the second line from prescription no to yes in hazard period. It might induce the spurious association. Our real increased risk was 2, but in the situation of increased drug utilization, our calculated matched odds ratio might be 3, and we might might conclude we found a threefold increased risk of association. These are how we can calculate the case-time control odds ratio. Case-time control odds ratio is combining the case crossover odds ratio and control crossover odds ratio. For the case-time control study, we should select a control group. In this case, for the case, we calculate the case crossover odds ratio equation A, number of exposed in hazard, divided by number of exposed in control. For the control group, we should again calculate the control crossover odds ratio B, and then we combine this equation A and equation B. Case-time control odds ratio C can be calculated using the odds ratio A divided by odds ratio C. These are the example of case-time control study between the cholinesterase inhibitor use and hospitalization for bradycardia. The first line is overall adjusted odds ratio. In this case, these are the case-time control odds ratio 2.13, and these authors concluded they found twofold increased risk of bradycardia. You can calculate by hands. In this case, though these authors did not present the case crossover odds ratio or control crossover odds ratio, they presented the distribution of exposure in hazard and control period. The second line, for the number of case 161, there are 139 exposure in risk interval, which is same with hazard period, 22 in control period. You might calculate 139 divided by 22. They might conclude if they conducted case crossover study, increased risk was 6.32, very high increased risk. Third line is control crossover odds ratio. For the control group, the estimated odds ratio was 2.98. 349 divided by 117, and then they combined two odds ratio, 6.32 divided by 2.98, and they concluded their final odds ratio was 2.13. However, there are also limitations in case-time control study. As this is a type of case control study, there are potential for selection biases if we could not find appropriate control persons. And the second limitation is it may not be true if change in exposure probability over time differs based on subject characteristics. Therefore, in 2011, Dr. Wang proposed case-time control study, CCTC. CCTC design uses within and between time comparison to evaluate short-term effects at the same time for a measured time invariant compounder and exposure time trends. CCTC uses person time sampling strategy to match each case to future case at least for the outcome, and these future cases represent the source population that gave rise to cases and meet the same inclusion and exclusion criteria. In 2011, Dr. Wang proposed future cases as present control to adjust for exposure trend, and she called it case-time control design. And next year, in 2012, she published the real-world example between the antipsychotic use and ischemic stroke in the stroke. And she concluded the adjusted odds ratio was 1.8 times higher when exposed to antipsychotic than when unexposed. These are the summary of three designs: case crossover, case time control, and case time control. Case crossover is most simple. Compare the exposure status between hazard and control period. Case time control selects the control and they compare the case crossover odds ratio and control crossover edge ratio, and they induce the final case time control odds ratio. Case time control, they don't have to select the different control group. They use their present control as they use future cases as their present control, and they compare the comparison between these cases and future cases, and they estimate the case time control odds ratio. These are the example of case time control. In this case, she would like to investigate the vitamin use and stroke incidence. For the case crossover study, she found 1.5 increased risk between vitamin use and stroke. When she calculated the odds ratio using future case control, the adjusted odds ratio was 1.4, and final case time control odds ratio was 1.1. And now we can conclude that vitamin use and stroke incidence was not association, have not an association. Strength of case time control design is the data requirement issue. Case crossover and case time control only requires data on cases, while case time control needs a separate control group. And case time control adjusts for violation of case crossover assumption regarding stability of exposure over time, while case time control adjusts for population level time trends. Future case may be better represent the expected time trend in exposure than age, sex, time matching non-cases in the case time control study. However, there are also limitations of case time control study. CCTC assumes non-causal time trend. Person time sampled from cases is the same with matched future cases. And the second limitation is reduced sample size after matching. Future cases may not avail for rare cases in the study period. In that case, they don't have enough period of time to capture the future cases. I will explain my real-world example in part 2. These are the paper published in this month, Journal of Antimicrobial Chemotherapy. These are for the investigating the use of oseltamivir, which is the medication for relieving the symptom of influenza and prevention and the risk of neuropsychiatric adverse events. In this example, for the case definition, we identified all patients who had been prescribed oseltamivir prior to the neuropsychiatric adverse events between 2009 and 2013. And we set a 14-day hazard period in our main analysis. As our cohort study as previous cohort study reported the median time from influenza diagnosis to the first CNS outcome of 13 days. And we set our washout period as 7-day risk interval, reflecting the 5-day treatment course and the half-life of this medication. And we set 3 consecutive control periods of the same duration as the hazard period for each case. It is a very important part, and every reviewer and every person would like to know why we should set the 14-day or 7-day, and you should write the rationale why you set specific duration of this hazard and control period. For this case, at first we found the 300,000 patients neuropsychiatric adverse events, and then we found newly diagnosed neuropsychiatric adverse events. As this is more identical to the case control study, it is good to keep the incident cases for the case crossover study. Our final subjects were 5,000 patients. In this case, we conducted several sensitivity analysis. Our main analysis is focused on 14-day hazard period and 7-day washout period, but for the case crossover study, you should several sensitivity analysis varying the duration of hazard and control periods. In this case, we changed it from 2 days, 7 days, 28 to 56 days. For the washout period, we changed our duration to 14, 28, and 56. These are the main results. For the 14-day time window, third line, you could find the increased risk was 1.28 and the risk was elevated when we set the time window 2 days and 7 days, 1.50 and 1.32. The risk was constant but a little bit decreased, 1.25 in 28 time window and 1.13 in 56 days. Recently, many reviewers for the case crossover design require the time trend of drug utilization and incidence. In this case, this figure indicates the number of patients oseltamivir, and you could find a very there was a pandemic in 2009 in Korea, influenza pandemic. The incidence of neuropsychiatric adverse events remain very constant regardless of the year. Whereas the prescription of oseltamivir were mainly concentrated from winter to early spring each year because it's the medication against the influenza. Therefore, sensitivity analysis was conducted using control periods apart from 11 months, 12 months, and 13 months before the index date to control the seasonality issue. In this case, we found constant results 1.59, 1.33, and 1.73 for the adjusted odds ratio. These are the rest examples for case time control design. These are the issues between the proton pump inhibitor use and risk of Clostridium difficile diarrhea in high-risk antibiotic users. For this case, you might observe the case crossover odds ratio, adjusted odds ratio was 2.0, and the next line is control crossover odds ratio, 1.2. And for the risk window 42 days, control crossover odds ratio was almost 1. And for the 56 days of this window, control crossover odds ratio was 1.1. In this case, case crossover odds ratio and control crossover case time control odds ratio was almost similar. Our final conclusion was case time control odds ratio 1.7, 1.8, and 1.8. These are my lecture's summary. For the case crossover design, it is very important to find the right questions. For the case crossover design, drug should be brief and drug should have a transient effect and outcome should be an acute onset disease. And writing a rationale for hazard and control period is very important step in case crossover study, and this cordon pair only contributes to case crossover analysis. Case time control design corrects for time trend of drug use by incorporating a control group of patients who did not experience the outcome of interest. The rest design, case time control, is using within and between case comparison, and controls are future cases in this design by person time sampling strategy. Thank you for listening.
Because the control period you selected was for the hazard period, and what if you select, since the exposure is 2 months in, it's an acute outcome.
Yeah.
What happens if you select control period?
Yeah.
From the other direction.
Yeah, I understand. That's very good point and very nice questions. And the next speaker, Ricky Lopez, might cover the bidirectional design. In this case crossover design normally use unidirectional because if some adverse event happen, the drug exposure pattern might be changing. So normally for the case crossover, the unidirectional design is frequently used, but you will serve your question in the next presentation.
Okay, thank you everyone. I'm going to talk about two designs today, sequence symmetry analysis and the self-controlled case series method. Just my disclosures, I'm funded by the Australian Government, our National Research and Medical Council. Our research centre doesn't accept any money from drug companies. So, I've already said that. Let's start with sequence symmetry analysis. What is it? This is a very simple method. I love it. It's my favourite method of all. It examines the likelihood of getting one prescription, or an event, you can use the event, before another prescription. So it asks this very simple question. Did you get medicine A? If you got medicine A and B, if you got both, did you get medicine A before you got medicine B? Or did you get medicine B before you got medicine A? The question is as simple as that. So it only uses incident cases, and this is really important. You only look for the first time you ever got these medicines. And quite simply, we think if these things are independent, it would just be a chance event. The likelihood of getting medicine A before B or B before A would be the same. A coin toss. But if medicine A causes a side effect that is treated by medicine B, we expect that there will be more medicine B after medicine A, and so it will be asymmetrical, hence the name. So, the sequence, the ratio, the statistic of interest is called the sequence ratio, and it's very simple. We calculate the number of people who got medicine A before medicine B, and we divide it by the number of people who got medicine B before they got medicine A. See? It's very simple. I love the fact about this method that we can present the relationship graphically, and for me, this is one of the really important things about this method, because this aids in the interpretation, because you can analyse the temporal association. And the graphic is very simple. We put in the middle the day that you started the new medicine. So we're looking for a symmetry. Along the bottom is time. The time on the right-hand side is the number of people with the event who started medicine B after medicine A. So that's the group who possibly have an adverse event. The group on the left are the number of people who had medicine B before medicine A. They're kind of serving as our control group, yeah? So, it's easy. You only need prescription data. It's a within-person design, effectively, so it's robust to confounders over a short period of time. But you do need to adjust for underlying seasonal or marketing trends, and you can, which is part of the problem that Julian was talking about. So this is all you need in your data set, 3 variables. It's partly why I love it. On occasions I have done these analyses while I'm standing here. That's how fast they are, and it's always fun to do that. You need the code that identifies the medicine, you need the date it was supplied, and you need a patient identifier. I'm going to show you the example of amiodarone-induced hypothyroidism. So amiodarone is an antiarrhythmic agent, so it's a medicine that affects your heart, and it contains iodine in its chemical structure. Your thyroid gland loves iodine, and so not surprising when you take this medicine, it can upset your thyroid gland, and it can cause either hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. And today we're just going to look at hypothyroidism, and there's already a meta-analysis of randomised control trials. This is a really well-known adverse event, and the meta-analysis tells me that the odds ratio is 4.2. So, if we were to implement this method in practice, the first thing we would do, if we're using a medicine data set, so this is its limitation, you have to find a medicine that can treat the adverse event, and you preferably have to find a very specific medicine, hence this example. Thyroxine is only used for hypothyroidism. Yeah? So we know every time someone gets thyroxine, they're treating hypothyroidism. You have to define the time window with which you want to look at the sequences. How long a period are you going to allow between medicine A and medicine B for you to attribute them as connected? And then you calculate the sequence ratio. So, we're going to select amiodarone. I've already hinted that we're looking at thyroxine. And we use the waiting time distribution. Again, I think this comes from Jasper. We run the waiting time distributions, and you go through your data set, you find the first prescription for everybody, only the first prescription, so you end up with the data table, data structure of first prescriptions. If you're not used to doing this work, whenever you do it, you will find always at the start of the data set a big number of people. And there are people who are already on the medicine. You know, they were on it in this month. We couldn't see them because it's not in our data set. So remember that the method requires incident users, so we get rid of these people. I'll just show you thyroxine in our, getting used to the system. Thyroxine in our data set too. Because in Australia, this comes in a packet of 200. So you can just see the difference in the prevalent population here and here. This comes in a pack of 30 amiodarone. So we have to get rid of all of these people here, yeah? So all of the prevalent users we have to get rid of. Okay, so what exposure, what period of time would you allow the sequences to happen? Remember that nearly 70% of adverse events of medicines happen in the first 2 months. Okay, there's lots of literature on that. So you want a relatively short time window, and we want a time window where it's still time invariant, yeah? We don't want confounding over time. You can use 3, 6, 9 or 12 months. We tend to use 12 at our place. We think 12 months works better. In a validity study we did, that's what we found. But you've got to be thinking about when might this adverse event occur. Okay, and this is what happens. This is the result. So, in the middle we have when we started amiodarone. On the right-hand side is those who started thyroxine after. On the left, those who started thyroxine before. It's 722 people on the right and 168 on the left. We're simply going to divide one by the other and we get 4.3. And I'm sure we could do this in an A, B, C, D, E plot. But, you know, effectively it's the same kind of idea. And look at that, it's almost identical to the meta-analysis of the randomised controlled trials. But prescribing trends can affect this statistic. So we need to calculate something that's called a null effect sequence ratio. So if you look at this is amiodarone and this is thyroxine. So amiodarone is flat. This picture is from the prevalent population. So flat, growing. Remember, this is looking at things that are happening in me. I'm taking one and the other, and I'm looking to see if this is a chance event. So because thyroxine is growing, if there was no association between these two medicines, just by chance, I would be more likely to get thyroxine after amiodarone because of the prescribing trend. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah? Great. So, we have to calculate a null sequence ratio. There are a couple of different methods to do this. You can use the whole exposure time period, you can use sections of the time periods, you can even use splines. But essentially you want a method that gets you to adjust for that trend. Once you're able to do that, you just divide one by the other. It's a bit like you can see these designs have a lot in common. A bit like the case time control window, yeah? And so now we divide our 4.3 by our 1.25 and we get our adjusted sequence ratio of 3.4. Just another example, because the picture is slightly different. Do non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents cause heart failure? So there are quite a few medicines you might pick to use heart failure, but the one that's really indicative, at least in our country, of an exacerbation of heart failure is furosemide. You want big fluid diuresis when you've got heart failure exacerbation. And this is what the picture looks like, okay? So you can see the asymmetry. This is weeks 1, 2, 3. You can see that the side effect starts in the second, third week, almost immediate. It's what we'd expect with this side effect. We always exclude day 0 because you can't tell. If someone gets a prescription on day 0, did they take the drug that day or the next day? So we just leave it out of our picture. We can calculate it, we leave it out. And you can see, I think what's interesting about this, I'd love one day to be able to analyse the shapes. I haven't worked out how to do that yet. But the picture tells me a story because we wouldn't expect it to be way up here for these kinds of side effects. Prescription event is exactly the same thing, except that at the medicine B is now perhaps a hospitalisation. If you're lucky enough to have an electronic health record or something else, you can use event. And I just want to show you this one because I wish we'd been using this method in 2002. We might have withdrawn this drug from the market a whole lot earlier, or we might have decided at least to warn people a whole lot earlier. This is rofecoxib, which was withdrawn from the global market in 2004 because it causes heart attack. So I'm using the hospital data set with my prescription data set now. These are all the people who got their heart attack after starting rofecoxib. These are the people before, and you can see this very interesting pattern of events. And we get an adjusted odds, a sequence ratio of 1.7, which the approved trial showed us in 2008, so a long time after this event that the regulators can use. We've got our regulators in our country using this routinely now. Just like every other method, there are some assumptions that must be met. And you can think for lots of these case-only designs, they are really only suitable for acute events. This one is not suitable when medicine initiation is associated with the event. So if I wanted to do, does morphine cause falls or fractures? Morphine causes you to fall over and go to hospital because of a fracture. Well, when you go to hospital for your fracture, you get morphine. Yeah? It won't work. Yeah? The event causes the associations. It's not suitable. And I would tell you all, please, just look at the graphics every time as well. You can, because things can be funny. This is the question about acute events. So we could ask a question like, does perindopril, a medicine for blood pressure, cause osteoporosis? But if we thought that could possibly be true, you'd have to take perindopril for a long time because osteoporosis would be slow to develop. So we wouldn't expect to see this, but we can look at it because we can run bisphosphonates as a medicine for treatment, and what you can see is it's just symmetrical. Yeah, it's just symmetrical. This is what we'd expect. But there are some, and that's where I'd say be careful. This kind of idea that the event can cause the association with the medicine, or you can have protopathic bias. And protopathic bias and things like that, you can see better if you look at the graphic. This is really relatively symmetrical. Yeah, there's not really an association here. But if we'd asked this question, does perindopril cause dizziness, we might have used prochlorperazine as our indicator. But of course, if you've got really high blood pressure, you might turn up and get prochlorperazine, because you might turn up and present with vertigo, not. And if someone hasn't measured your blood pressure, something like this can happen. This is confounded, yeah? But you wouldn't know from the statistic that this was confounded, but you can see in the graphic that this is confounded. Okay, please also examine your waiting time distributions because you need a stable waiting time distribution. And this is just an example from Australia where calcium was delisted from our system. Veterans Affairs put it back on, and then the osteoporosis medicines came as a combination product with calcium packed in the packet. There is no way, oops, sorry, I keep going the wrong way. There is no way that the null sequence ratio can adjust for this. It's good, but it's not that good. Yeah, and you don't use this period of time. Pick a different observation period in your data set. And this is just a different example, but again, it's a waiting time distribution. And we've got just 1 month, but it's 3,000 people. So in 1 month, 3,000 people have come on to flowchart in this data set because rofecoxib was withdrawn from the market. But again, if you were doing sequence symmetry analysis, you get some funny numbers if you chose this month in there. So really important to look at these to make sure it's not confounded. How valid is this method? So we have tested this method on 165 positive and negative controls and compared it, because we were asking the question, would it be useful for our regulators in Australia to use this? So we compared it to kind of validity that we might get from spontaneous reports. So what's really important is the negative result, okay? Its sensitivity is 65%. So it picks up a lot, but it doesn't pick up everything it should pick up. So be careful that you don't assume the negative results mean it's not a problem if you think there's biological plausibility in case reports. Be careful of associations that you might consider protective. They could be confounded, really important to look at that left side bias, or it could be that it's the other causal relationship that you just haven't thought about yet. So, just in conclusion for this one, it's really a feasible, simple and practical tool that you can run rapidly. It needs a minimal data set. Its limitation, if you're only using a prescription data set, is that there are many adverse reactions we'd like to look at. There isn't a specific medicine to treat, and so it doesn't work for many things. When you've got the electronic health record data sets, you can do more, but the event being associated with subsequent exposure is a problem in those data sets that you've got to look out for too. So we think it's more useful for signal detection exploratory data hypothesis than perhaps data mining per se, because it's hard to data mine the visualisations. Okay, that was sequence symmetry analysis. I'm going to flip, because it's a bit similar, but to the self-controlled case series. So, just like every other talk today, it uses data on cases only to estimate the effect of a time-dependent exposure on an outcome. Just like everything else, it's best for acute events and transient exposures. Just like everything else, we calculate the incidence of adverse events within exposed periods compared to unexposed periods, but it includes unexposed periods before and after the exposure period, and that's pretty important. So, just remember, you select everyone who has the event. That's really important. Everyone who has the event. You find out when the medicine was initiated. You have unexposed periods. You create risk periods for the times of interest that you're interested in looking at after people have started the medicine. And you take unexposed periods from after people were exposed, after your risk periods. This is why it's best for medicines that are used transiently. It's not a good method for medicines that are used chronically, yeah? It differs from the case crossover design in that we have these unexposed periods, okay? So in the case crossover designs, the designs that Judy talked about, we stop at the hazard, yeah? But we have these unexposed periods. So, like everything else, it controls inherently for fixed, measured, and unmeasured patient-specific confounders. And the one thing you can do with this method, you can include unexposed cases, which actually has the effect of adjusting for age or calendar year or frailty over time. Where's my picture gone? There we go. Some assumptions that must be met. Just like everything else, it's got assumptions that the events must be independent and not recurrent. So, you know, the fact that you have a hospitalisation may mean that you're at risk of having another hospitalisation shortly after. Heart failure is a good example of this. If you have a hospitalisation for heart failure, you're likely to have another hospitalisation for heart failure shortly after. So that's a problem in this method because we're wanting independent events. If the outcome is rare and you only use the first hospitalisation, then this assumption won't be breached, okay? But the outcome has to be rare, and rare we're talking about less than 10%, okay? Another assumption, that the occurrence of the event must not alter subsequent exposure. That's a bit like the prescription symmetry example. So here, you know, it's the same idea. Opioids cause falls, well, falls might be treated with opiates. The way you overcome that is to include pre-risk periods in the model. And I'll show you what happens in the example of that. But if we were doing antipsychotic initiation of stroke, you might find that once you're in you can't have a subsequent stroke easily after. They're not independent events. Another assumption is that the occurrence of the event must not censor or affect the observation period, because we're looking at a whole period of time because we want unexposed periods after time. And if the event causes you to die, then there is no unexposed period after time. Yep. So death is an example where this isn't met, and you have to go to the super advanced course to learn about the methods that overcome that problem. But let's have a look at a real-world example. Let's ask the question, do antipsychotics cause pneumonia? And remember that we've got to pick up everybody who has a pneumonia hospitalisation to get into my study. We've got our period of time when we've picked an antipsychotic, and we've got our post-exposure risk periods. In this example, I'm just using one post-exposure risk period, but you can divide this time up. It could be 30 days, 30 days, 30 days. It could be I'm interested in the first 7 days, then I'm interested in the next 28 days, and then I'm interested in the next 6 months. They don't have to be in the same period of time. And if you've got a very long observation period, what you see here is just one, but you might find another exposure period and another event in a subsequent observation, a subsequent section of the observation period. In this example, I've used a washout period, just because some medicines there's some hangover effects, or in many of our data sets we might not be sure when exposure to the drug actually stops, and so a washout period helps overcome that. So the pneumonia hospitalisation, it might occur in the risk period, it might occur in the washout period, it might occur in our unexposed period. It can occur anywhere in this once we've got it set up. We've got our exposed time, and we've got our unexposed time, and we use all our unexposed time here, and if we're including cases who are unexposed to the medicine, we take that too, because this is the group that we put in to adjust for age. Yeah? We then do a conditional Poisson regression, and if we have time-varying confounders, we adjust for it in the model. If you did that in this study, you'd get this result, and it would show you that pneumonia occurs with an odds ratio or an incident rate ratio of 2.4. But you remember that I told you that there were assumptions that must be met for this method, so let's have a look at them. The first one is proper language is event-dependent observation periods. I always get confused with the proper language, so I'll just go for the other bit. Does the event influence the length of the observation period? And the other one, event-dependent exposure. Does the occurrence of the event influence subsequent exposure? And I just want to show you what you can do with the first one. Does the occurrence of the event influence the length of the observation period? So, quite simply, create a histogram between the event and the end of the observation period using a sensory indicator. So simply create two groups, the group who died during the study period and the group who were observed until study end. Plot them both as a histogram, okay? So, those who didn't die and those who died. And straight away you can see, so this is plotting from the time of the event until the end of the observation period. So you can already see that we've got a group of people who there wasn't much after time. They died, so there wasn't much after time. And in this slide, we've got some people that are in the data set for a long time, in our observation period for a long time. So we've got a problem. Okay, the moment we do this, we've got a problem. But we can compare our original model, our baseline model, to an interaction model. And essentially, sorry, that just says the same thing. Essentially what we do, so this is our original model. We take our censored population only, and we create the incident rate ratio. We take our uncensored population, and we create the incident rate ratio. And you can see they're the same. And we do a likelihood test, and you can see it's non-significant. So even though the assumption wasn't met, by doing this method, we know that it hasn't affected our result. So we can trust our result and continue on. Okay? Sorry. The next one, does the occurrence of the event influence the subsequent exposure? Again, we do a plot. We do a centered plot, and it's the histogram of the time before the start of the exposure, so the opposite. When did exposure start and when did the event happen? And if we did that, we'd get, so this is a bit like the sequence symmetry plot, you've got to go to the middle point. The middle point is when we started, and then we're saying how many days since the antipsychotic before the event, after and before. This one's a bit hard to see, but see that second line there? If I showed you properly, it's on the left of the centre plot. Okay? So there are a large number of events just prior to initiation of the antipsychotic. That suggests that we've got a short-term likelihood of being exposed, and that's event-dependent exposure. Therefore, what do? We add in a pre-risk period. Because we've got a group of people who've probably got pneumonia, they get delirium, they get the antipsychotic for their delirium, and it's affecting the thing. So we put in the pre-risk period. We do then exactly the same thing. We have our models, but now we've got 4 periods of time that we're looking at. We're looking at our exposure period, what's the incident rate there, what's the incident rate in our pre-risk period, what's the incident rate in our washout period, yeah, so that we can get rates in all of those times and get the effect. How long should that pre-risk period be? I'd say to you, please ask a clinician. But you can actually have a look. This is just showing you how incident rate ratios vary in this example. So everything's significant. So these results mean that the pre-risk period doesn't change the example, but here's where the result is if we don't use a pre-risk period. This is with 14 days, 28 days, 42 days, 56 days, 70 days. So what you can see is it gets stable out here at 70 days, and the pre-risk periods here move the results. So if we didn't have the pre-risk period, the confidence intervals all cross over, so it probably doesn't matter. But it's another way of checking that the assumption is met. Oops. This is just to show you have to check. So this is the same kind of question, but for 5 different outcomes, which means it's 5 different studies, the number of cases, because the case is the thing that we're selecting. We've got 5 different studies, all with different numbers of people in them. But the stroke event was not robust to our event-dependent assumption. And so it's just important to check every outcome that you do this for and not think, oh, it worked for one, so it won't be held for the others. Death is a problem in stroke. And if we looked at so we got a baseline model which said it was significant, but if we looked at our censored population and our uncensored population, you'd see that those results are really flipped, and our likelihood ratio test is showing that there's a problem. Okay, and so that means you can't trust the result for stroke from this method. Oops. So it's important to check the assumptions, and it's important to check the assumptions for each outcome. So this method very similar to the others, but we're using exposure, post-exposure, unexposed periods after. That's its big advantage. And you have ways of checking the assumptions, which is really helpful. Just to put these 2 methods in context, we would argue that sequence symmetry analysis is very good in the signal detection space, and the self-controlled case series sits down here with, alongside the cohort studies or confirmation studies. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much. And now I can send you questions. Yes? And I hope I can answer them. I'll do, when I work with a number of statisticians, and when they're at clinical meetings with me, they always go, I'm only a statistician, I'm not a clinician. So I'll do the opposite. I'm only a clinician, I don't have any statistical skills. Just in case I get some hard statistical questions. But I'm sure there's more statistics in the room.
Hello, my name is Null and I'm from South Korea. I know that in the CCS design, the observation time is fixed from start to end. And I know that the calendar time is used for fixing. But do you know why the calendar time is used, and if the follow-up time can be used instead?
Let me just make sure I heard the question, and then I think I'll throw the question to the room. So the observation period is fixed, and then the
calendar times are used for the fixing of the observation period. But I'm wondering if follow-up time can be used, the follow-up periods.
The follow-up periods are used.
If they can be used.
Yes, they can be used. The follow-up periods can be used, yes.
Instead of the calendar time?
Instead of, that's the bit I'm having trouble hearing. Can someone?
So if someone, say it's from January 2010 to December 2017.
Yeah.
But that's in calendar time.
That's
but
right.
If everyone's followed over 10 years, can the follow-up time be used instead of the calendar time?
Can the follow-up time be used instead of the calendar time? Every study I've ever seen using this method uses a fixed observation period. I've never seen a method, because the method is, so you take all cases. I don't know that I can see how that would work. You're saying, because you've got to go, I'm taking everyone who has the case, and the case has to happen in a period of time. So I've got to select an observation time.
Yes.
I've got to do that. So, and then you're, in that observation time you've only got the options of unexposed time and exposed time and pre-risk, and I can't imagine how you could do it the other way with follow-up. But, the great thing about being at a conference like this is, well, people develop methods. You've seen that. Malcolm McClure's method started in 1991, Sammy Sweese's in 1995. So we'd invite you to develop and test a method. I can't imagine, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. That's the great thing about being researchers. So, you'd have to just validate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia. That was a really nice presentation. My name is Kate. I'm from Monash University. I've just got a question in regards to the sequence symmetry analysis. As you really know, that at the moment we're actually encouraging prescribers to cease or stop medications if they do have an adverse event on a patient, rather than starting a new medication that helps with the adverse event. If that sort of is more implemented in practitioners, do you think that potentially in the future it might be more difficult to gather sort of an adequate sample size to when practitioners start?
I don't think so. So you can only get in the sequence ratio if you've had both. So it is true. So this is the trick. These techniques can't be used for estimating prevalence of the event or other things, because the people who have the adverse event and stop don't get in at all. Jasper will be able to tell me which way that biases the study design, because if you've got to think it through, and quickly off the top of my head I'm thinking, I don't know if I can come up with an example, because it might bias the sequence ratio one way a little bit, but it's not a lot, and even now, so I haven't seen results recently just because I haven't been looking for them, but the Australian study where we looked at, other people looked at, I did not, but what happens once you have how long does it take you to get an adverse event, and what happens once you have it? I think of the people who got the adverse event, 90% of them stopped it. So often that doesn't happen. Where this method is really good is when we're not expecting an adverse event, because we treat. So that for me is why it's quite exciting. Because when I first used to do this work, the non-steroidal picture that I showed you with heart failure, I used to say it was really great that we could show this, because every doctor should be aware of it, and how, and so the fact that we still see it is a worry, but it will be under, because lots of doctors already know, and they won't be treating at-risk patients. But if you think about the new medicines coming to market, the doctors aren't expecting, they're not thinking, it's an adverse event necessarily, and they're often responding with a treatment. And that's why, for signal detection, I think the method is really quite powerful. Thank you very much. Thumbs up from Jasper, that's good, isn't it?
Thank you. Thank you for the organizers to invite me. It's my thankless role to, after having heard about all the wonderful things you can do with self-controlled designs, I'm now to explain the limitations. I was reminded a bit about the natural course of enthusiasm for a newly marketed drug. You start by thinking this is a new miracle, everyone should use it, and after a while you learn about the problems with it. It is poisoned, I wouldn't give this drug to a dog. And finally, when you learn to balance the two things, it has its place. And there's a similar order with the new design. There's a natural course of enthusiasm. It's a miracle, everyone should use it. It's useless, it's full of pitfalls, and finally it has its place. And my job is to find out exactly where are we on this curve for the self-controlled designs. I divided my talk into 3 subjects. One about exposure-specific problems. We've all heard about it should be mainly transient exposure, but it's not always required for all of the designs. Some outcome-specific problems. We talked about abrupt outcomes versus non-abrupt outcomes. And some exposure outcome-related or association-related, if you will, that of time-dependent confounding, and what to do when you want to study cumulative drug effects. Let's have a look at some of this. There are some exposure issues. For some of the designs, the exposure has to be transient. It's a requirement for the case crossover and the case time control. If the exposure is not transient, you cannot use any of these designs. But actually, it's not a requirement if you want to do a symmetry analysis or a self-controlled case series. They can actually work even if the patient stays on the treatment once they're put on the treatment. But there are lots of problems with chronic use, and in the end of my talk, I'll get back to those. There are issues with the outcome. It has to be abrupt. Examples would be myocardial infarction, it could be stroke, it could be fractures, it could be gastrointestinal beats, etc. But for some outcomes like cancer, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome, you don't really know when the disease starts. Particularly for cancer, if it's a cancer buried deep in one of your internal organs, it can grow actually for months or even years before it's clinically evident. And since you cannot determine the timing of the outcome, you cannot relate it to whether it's in the pre or the current exposure or post-exposure window. You wouldn't know, and your analysis will be deeply biased or confounded. So don't do this. There's the issue of exposure outcome problems, one of time-dependent confounding and one about cumulative drug effects. Let's look at them. And I might add that if it's a matter of a cumulative drug effect, don't do self-controlled designs that will not get you the right result. Time-dependent confounding is actually a bit tricky. It can be resolved by multivariate modeling. For example, in the case crossover design, we will always map the main exposure, but if there are other time-dependent exposures, you can map them as well and introduce them into your conditional regression model, and in that way adjust for whatever time-dependent covariates or confounders there are. It's also built in explicitly in the theoretical framework for the self-controlled case series. But there are some limitations. I have met the claim sometimes that self-controlled designs cannot justify for confounding by indication, and I believe that is largely untrue. And the reason is that the indication is nearly always time-dependent. You get antibiotics when you are infected. You don't get antibiotics when you're not infected. You get antidepressants when you're depressed. You don't get antidepressants when you're not depressed. And you get antihypertensives when you are equipped with a diagnosis of hypertension. You don't take them if you're not equipped with a diagnosis of hypertension, and so on and so forth. So if the indication is a confounder in the strictest sense, it will also be a time-dependent confounder. So we've learned that the self-control designs do not inherently remove time-dependent confounding. So, in essence, they will not remove confounding by indication as such. That's bad news. For how do we deal with it then? Well, in conventional cohort or case control studies, one way to deal with it is to use active comparators. For example, if I suspect that penicillin causes deep venous thrombosis, I would have confounding by indication, since penicillin is given typically for upper respiratory infections, which might by itself trigger a deep venous thrombosis. So if I do a mindless self-control study on the association between penicillin and deep venous thrombosis, I will get a confounded result. So the trick here is to find an active comparator which is given for the same indication, but for which I do not suspect that it causes the outcome, in this case deep venous thrombosis. So I could compare the risk of having deep venous thrombosis in new uses of penicillin versus new uses of macrolide antibiotics, and get the right result, thereby having adjusted for the indication. So I was wondering, could you do that for the self-control designs as well, having an active comparator adjusted self-control design? And the answer is yes. Now we have a new design on the way. I'm currently working on a paper describing how to incorporate active comparators in all of the conventional self-control designs. I think the bottom line here is that if you have confounding by indication, you are in a bit of trouble using self-control designs, and please consider doing something else. There's also the issue of cumulative drug effects, and the most obvious example here is that of the drug-cancer associations. You don't get a cancer for just having taken one pill. It takes years of cumulative exposure. And the more you have accumulated of the drug over time, the higher your incidence rate of the outcome, in this case the cancer, would be, provided that there is an association. You could not meaningfully study this in a case crossover design. Imagine here a patient who develops a GI cancer. You ascertain that cumulative exposure of the drug at the outcome time and compare it to a reference time. But as the cumulative exposure can never be smaller with time, it will always grow. So your combined history, all the drugs, all the doses you're obtaining of this drug cannot become smaller with time. So you will always compare a higher dose at the outcome with a lower dose at the reference time. So it doesn't make sense to attempt to address this by a case crossover design. You might actually, I haven't seen it though, you might actually do it in a bi-directional self-control design, but I think there would be too many problems. It all relates to the hazard function. Whenever you embark on a study, you should consider what is the relationship between onset of drug therapy and the development of the outcome. And I would argue that the home court of the self-control designs, that is the hazard ratio where they are most efficient and most appropriate, would be in the very simple hazard function. This would, for example, illustrate the hazard function for a drug-cancer association, and please don't use the self-control designs here. Now, I've dedicated the last part of my talk to describing some of the problems that you have when there are lots of chronic users in your drug user population. A naive and I believe wrongful understanding of this problem would go like this. Nearly all drugs have mixed populations, chronic and episodic users. The chronic users are those who take a drug all the time. We've learned that for you to be contributing to a self-controlled design, you have to have some time when you take the drug, some time when you don't take the drug. So those who are drug users all the time, they are concordant, and they are removed from the analysis. The same goes for those who are non-users all the time. So what we have left is a group of people who are intermittent users, who have spent time using a drug and who have spent time not using the drug. And since we throw out the chronic users, there are lots of them. It may be a loss of precision, but what we are left with, those who change exposure status, will give you the right answer. So it is at worst a loss of precision, not a bias. And as mentioned, this is wrong. Why is it wrong? I can show at least 3 examples where you get really wrong answers. The persistent user bias, the extreme sensitivity to misclassification, and something called exposure autocorrelation. Let's take an example. I want to study the association between a drug and an acute outcome. For example, retinal detachment. It's an acute eye disease. It's very easy to establish the time of onset, and there are, to my knowledge, no known drug associations. This doesn't occur as a consequence of drug. This is a mapping of a person who changes between being exposed and unexposed to a drug. So this person would contribute to a case crossover, a study of the association of this drug and retinal detachment. Let's imagine the simplest case crossover design. I have an outcome time and I have a reference time, and I compare the exposure status. This person is unexposed at the outcome, the retinal detachment, and exposed at the reference time. As we've learned, there are only 4 possible combinations. Sorry. Oh. Wrong button. There are only 4 possible combinations: exposed on both, unexposed on both, and 2 types of discordant exposure. Those who are either exposed or unexposed on both occasions, they go out, and what you're left with is the 2 types of discordant pairs, and the odds ratio is the simple ratio between these 2. Imagine a patient who has a reason to start taking statins, say an MI, and we want to study association between statin and retinal detachment. It is possible for this person to have an outcome where he's a statin user and also a statin user at his reference time. It's possible for him to be unexposed on both occasions. It's also possible for him to be exposed on his retinal outcome date, but not exposed on his reference date. But the 4th possible pattern, being unexposed at the outcome date and unexposed on the reference date, is impossible to fit anywhere. And that's the one that goes into the denominator. So when we calculate our odds ratio, our denominator will be very, very small, and we will have a very, very high odds ratio associating statin use with retinal detachment. Same will happen if the first treatment episode for some reason is lost to follow up. It's impossible to fit this particular pattern of exposure anywhere. The This is a busy slide. To my knowledge, the only empirical evidence of this persistent user bias, as we call it, we hypothesized that we could remove this bias by using a case time control design. Why is that? Because we would expect that exactly the same bias would apply to control. Imagine that this was not a retinal detachment case, but a control. His exposure pattern would be easily impossible to fit into this permanent statin user example. So we calculated the case crossover estimate for a lot of different drugs, and all of these estimates, which we believe are all null estimates in real life or null associations, all of these estimates came out at 1 or above 1, which I think proves the point that this is suspicious, this is probably biased output. We did the same calculation for controls, and all but 1 were above 1, as we would have expected, and the final case control estimate was just adjusted downward. Unfortunately, there seems to be a small residual bias. Some of these are clearly above 1, and 2 out of these 18 associations only were below 1. So even though we adjust for this persistent use by using controls, we still have a bias upward. It's published in the American Journal of Epidemiology, and one of the conclusions was that the optimal strategy for dealing with this problem is currently unknown. Perhaps this is where the case time control design would be appropriate. There are potential solutions to the persistent user bias, or you could actually say that case crossover design is the only one of the current self-control designs that is susceptible to this bias. All the others are inherently robust in some degree or the other. Incidentally, in response to this, Malcolm McClure has developed the case crossover design into a bidirectional case crossover design, which is, again, robust towards the persistent user bias. Another problem I want to illustrate is what I would call extreme sensitivity to misclassification if you have many chronic users. Imagine a scenario here. These are timelines. These are lots of untreated users. These are a lot of consistently treated users. These 2 are episodic users. We have an outcome date and we have a reference date. Ideally, only those 2 would contribute to my self-controlled study. All the others are either treated or untreated all the time, and they go out. Now, what happens if I introduce just a tiny bit of misclassification? Say, very few are in reality users at the outcome date, but I misclassify them as untreated, and vice versa. Now, instead of 2 persons contributing to my analysis, I have 10. And I've just introduced a very, very small element of misclassification. If this misclassification is random, this will be equivalent of completely random noise upon which my signal is to be seen. So even with a very, very small degree of misclassification, if I have lots of chronic users and non-users, I will have substantial misclassification bias. And not only that, the correct estimate is based on only 2 persons. My biased estimate will be based on 10 persons. So I have a too narrow confidence interval or an overconfidence in my biased result. The most likely type of misclassification would be that of truly exposed into apparently non-exposed. It's rare that a person who never used a drug suddenly would redeem a prescription for it. So this is by far the most common pattern, I believe. This is a problem with lots of chronic use. It's not a problem with lots of temporary uses and only few chronic uses. You see, if you misclassify these two, it will not matter much. If you misclassify among these, it will not matter much either, because the true pattern will dominate. And why does it happen? This is an example of how I build a prescription episode pattern based on prescription data. These are all prescriptions. I assign a duration to each prescription. And if that overlaps the start of the next prescription, I formally let it belong to the same treatment episode. So if I were to map the treatment episodes for this pattern, it would be like this. There's a gap here because this prescription ends before the next one begins. However, if I assign a period treatment to each prescription, which is just a little too short, these assigned treatment periods do not overlap, and my formal treatment pattern will look like this. It's full of holes, and I have misclassification of exposure and likely a very strong bias. Here's another potential way of being guilty of this bias. I believe it's pretty common. I've seen lots of exams where I suspect this to occur. We have an outcome date, we have a case window, and we have a reference window. I've assigned 30 days to each. Imagine this is a drug that is typically dispensed in supplies of 60 days. There's a 60-day dispensing here and here and here. Well, if it's dispensed in supplies of 60 days, it's almost impossible that two neighboring windows of 30 days will both have a prescription in it. So this will look as if the patients are all disaccordant, while the fact is that they're all taking the drug all the time and should be thrown out of the analysis. Actually, I'm not sure I've seen a single example where the authors go through the exercise of justifying the width of their windows by analyzing the typical distance between prescriptions that should belong to the same treatment episode. So I suspect this is actually a problem. So now I've described the persistent user bias, potentially a very strong bias upwards, and the hypersensitivity to misclassification, potentially a very strong conservative bias. So where do I end? Well, I think my own study might have been guilty of both sins. I wanted to demonstrate the upward bias by persistent use, but the odds ratios are not that high. The highest one is for all antidiabetics, 2.50 for retinal detachment in the case crossover estimate, and I believe a substantial explanation could be that I have misclassed exposure just a little bit. So I have included people who were truly users of antidiabetics all the time and should have been thrown out. They have been kept in my estimate and contributed with noise. Oh dear. There's even a third problem which has been demonstrated recently. Fortunately, it only pertains to case time control designs and where you have multiple reference times for the same individual. It's a bias away from the norm, that is an exaggerated effect. They explain it as a consequence of autocorrelation between exposures in the reference windows. That is, the second reference window has likely the same exposure attributes as the third or fourth or first, whatever. which I think would typically occur when you have chronic drug exposure, then there's an increased likelihood that these windows will all show the same exposure pattern. So it's a bit of a tricky pattern, what kind of biases these damn chronic users infer on our self-controlled analysis. It's certainly not as naive as I explained first. So to summarize, problems with chronic users, there's low statistical efficiency. Concordant users drop out. If they are dominant, you will only have few transient users. There's the persistent user bias, potentially strong bias output, hypersensitivity to misclassification, potentially strong bias towards null, and we get much too narrow confidence intervals, what I would call a false confidence in this biased result. And there's the exposure autocorrelation, which is a bias away from the null in the case-time control studies where you have multiple control windows. Oh dear. I tried to make an overview here. Sensitivity to chronic drug user problems. The persistent user bias only present in the case crossover, although there was a slight hint of it in our actual analysis of the retinal detachment, since most of the case-time control estimates were above 1. I don't expect it to be a problem in self-control cases, but I have no data to support it. I don't expect it to be a problem either in the symmetry analysis. Hypersensitivity to misclassification, definitely a problem in case crossover. Might be worse in case-time control, since now we have the same problem in the controls as well. Probably also present in self-control cases. I don't expect it in the symmetry analysis. And finally, in the autocorrelation bias, only a problem with the case-time control design. So, where should I put us on this map? I think we are clearly beyond this. There are lots of limitations. We shouldn't use it everywhere. My picture, the one I painted, is a bit grim. I think we're beyond that too, but probably so. So, if you have some of these problems, please choose something else, different from these self-control designs. And if you don't, you are on very thin ice.